so starting us off like we always do with number 10.
By Judge Rebecca Dallin, who gave him life without parole, sparking the outburst.
So that was 19-year-old Sandell Jackson, who appeared in front of a Milwaukee County Circuit judge who was sentencing him. Sandell was charged with first-degree intentional homicide and attempted robbery in the shooting death of a 21-year-old. Sandell pleaded guilty to the felony murder charges. He was given a life sentence, but was hoping for a chance at parole at some point of his sentencing, but the judge denied it, and that's when Sandell started to freak out. And everyone else in the courtroom was freaking out as well. Now at number 9, we have a girl who freaked out so bad, she started hiccuping. Like it was just uncontrollably. And I remember one time I hiccuped for like 6 months straight. It was really weird, so.
The parents testified, has a history of being someone who can be manipulated.
So this teenager, Jennifer Mee, was being tried in court for a murder charge, and she just couldn't keep calm. She was freaking out while being handcuffed. Jennifer Mee actually became famous after that video, and after years, she finally talked about that viral video.
What happened to that sweet 15-year-old girl that we first met?
I couldn't even tell you. I got cased up with the wrong crowd of people, really. Unfortunately, when I started experimenting with drugs, I just felt like I was invincible to everything.
Now she will be facing the rest of her life in prison, and she may not have the opportunity to ever leave. During the interview, she said that she thinks she deserves about 20 years, but not more than that.
Personally, I feel would be fair is at least 20 years. I do, because yes, somebody's life was taken, somebody's loved one, somebody's child.
Your attorney has said now there's less than a 1 to 2% chance of you ever getting out of here. How do you hold on to hope?
I can't put nothing past God, but I've been locked up since I was 19. I can't stop fighting. I have a family that wants me home.
Next up, at number 8, we have 17-year-old Racelyn Martin, who pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and this is after he killed his 63-year-old grandfather with a hatchet. Is this real life right now? He was sentenced to life in prison, and during court, Martin was freaking out. And this guy was just shaking. He was so scared. He was terrified of what was going to happen to him. Well, what else do you think is going to happen to you? Yeah, buddy, you're going to be in prison for the rest of your life. Okay, let's watch that again, but I'll slow it down a bit for you guys. It must be a very difficult case because both of his parents testified against him.
And appeared to be listening intently to testimony, occasionally nervously looking down. Tonight we heard testimony from both parents.
Moving into number 7, we have the youngest on our list, 13-year-old Kashawn Mann, who became the youngest person who committed murder in Kent County. Kashawn killed his mom's boyfriend. So after Kashawn's mom actually tried defending her 13-year-old son, the victim's family were outraged and chaos pursued in the courtroom.
That angered relatives of the victim, Jermel Stokes, leading to a scuffle.
The mom was saying that she actually found out her boyfriend was abusing her son and the murder was justified. I don't think that any murder can be justified, and also the mom was fighting for her son to not be tried as an adult. This is a crazy situation because you have this young kid who is abused, and now because of poor decisions, he's going to prison for the rest of his life.
This is a child. Yes, he may have committed an adult crime.
The judge was about to sentence her son, Kashawn Mann, for second-degree murder.
But obviously, after it all comes out, he was treated in ways that I had no clue of. So we can't say that, oh, he was never mistreated.
Moving into number 6.
Court physically shaking throughout the hearing. Then the sentence was read.
So therefore, it's the sentence of this court, Mr. Rose, that you be sentenced to serve a minimum of 10 years to a maximum of 15 years in prison.
So that was Stacy Rose Jr., who just couldn't believe his sentencing. Rose Jr. was caught up in a fight when 49-year-old Briscoe came outside to break up the fight. He was a father of one of the teenagers. He's also a father of 5 and a grandfather to 3 grandchildren. Rose Jr. fled the scene on foot through the neighborhood, but eyewitnesses was able to tell the police who the killer was, and he was quickly arrested. Outside of the courthouse, Rose Jr.'s mom was freaking out because she couldn't believe his sentencing.
So my son wasn't a drug dealer. They went over there and stole them pills out of his car.
Rose Jr. was very shocked to know he was sentenced for so long. He claims it was an accident. This teen was just shaking like crazy in the courtroom, and he was just crying right after his sentence. Alright, so at number 5, we have someone who isn't even a teenager yet, and she was freaking out. She appeared on an episode of Beyond Scared Straight. I love that show, and I love how they're such bad kids, they get reformed, and then they turn out to be okay kids. But the episode I'm going to show you guys is about a wannabe 12-year-old girl who thinks she's tough. Her name's Ashanti, and this girl was on track, to serve the rest of her life behind bars because she just seems so violent. Who knows what this little girl is capable of as she gets older.
I'm Ashanti, I'm 12, I like fighting, I threaten people, and I'm in the squad.
She's kind of speaking too gangster for me. I can barely hear what the heck she is saying, but from what I heard, she's not afraid of nobody. Well, until she was taken to a prison to see what her life was going to be like if she didn't change. Well, what you're about to see is someone who I've never seen be so afraid of anything before. This girl is just freaking out and just losing her mind, and she's like squealing, I think.
We're getting closer and closer. They are gonna love that hair back here, buddy. Here we go. Ain't no time to cry now, sister. Ain't no time to cry.
Okay, what the heck is even happening? She's just in panic mode. I'm not sure how tough this girl really is. Her tough act just seems to be fake. She's not ready for the real prison world. If she was, she wouldn't be acting like that. Number 4, we have teenager Roxana Silvorsky, who was emotionally freaking out in court while she was being sentenced. Silvorsky pleaded guilty to plotting to kill her family. Is this real life right now? Imagine being her family member and you just found out that this teenager, your daughter, your sister, she was plotting on murdering you. Well, luckily she was brought in by the police before anything bad happened, and now she is serving a very long time in a women's correctional facility. Number 3, I actually just wanted to show you guys quickly a different perspective, the opposite of someone freaking out in court, and he seemed to have zero emotions while he was being sentenced. I mean, watch this.
It is hereby ordered that you be committed to the Department of Youth Services until the age of 21, and furthermore committed to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Cedar Junction.
This kid was just sentenced to over 40 years in prison, and he didn't even flinch. He was just 14 years old when he stabbed his teacher to death. I mean, I don't know, is he freaking out inside? Number 2.
That's an extreme recklessness, and that's intent. That's maliciousness. That's a definition of malice.
So that was 17-year-old Jacob Morgan from Rock Hill, South Carolina. He found himself in court after he was charged with arson and murder connected with his 14-year-old brother's death. Prosecutors claim that Morgan maliciously and intentionally started a fire. Morgan was so shocked when he was sentenced.
So therefore, I am going to find that there is probable cause to charge the individual with the found over 4 years.
His life just flashed before his eyes. He didn't think that he would get such a long sentence. He was charged for manslaughter, so he received 10 years for that, and another 15 years for arson, which to me it kind of doesn't make sense because, well, let's think about it for a sec. 10 years for killing someone, 15 years for setting a house on fire. I mean, I don't know. Finally, number 1.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I count at least 20 officers in that room to retain 19-year-old Dexter Johnson. He was sentenced to death, so yeah, he was pretty pissed off.
Johnson, the jury has found you guilty of capital murder. In accordance with the laws of the state of Texas, this court hereby assesses your punishment of death. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is going to complete your jury service. I'm going to meet you in the jury room.
So Johnson sat down and he kind of let it sit in for a few seconds when he was sentenced, and just a few minutes went by when he realized that there's nothing else to lose. This guy just loses his cool and he just freaks out into a rage. I'm not sure if you guys noticed, but the woman in front just booked into the floor as if there was like a gunman in the room. She was just super scared. It seemed to come out of nowhere, and luckily there were so many police officers around because you never know what else Johnson would be capable of doing. I mean, he's already capable of murder, so what's one more murder to his rap sheet?
Starting off this countdown, we have TJ Lane. Back in February of 2012, 18-year-old TJ Lane entered a high school in Ohio and shot 3 students. He injured 3 others. There was no motive for his actions, and during his trial, he showed no remorse. In fact, during his sentencing, he was absolutely ruthless. He entered the court wearing a light blue button-up shirt, which he removed to reveal a white t-shirt with the word killer written on the front of it. If that's not bad enough, at one point he turned to the courtroom, said some obscene things, and then gave them a middle finger. You can see that he just doesn't care. It's scary how he shows like zero emotion, and he killed people. In our 9th spot, we have Chaylin Funes. 18-year-old Chaylin Funes was ruthless the night she killed a man named Eric Fisher. That night, she hit Fisher with her car, slamming him through a fence. Then she backed up, hit him again, and then dragged his body down the street. This was all witnessed by the man's family. During her sentencing, she broke down reading an apology note to the Fisher family, but the judge did not buy her apology. He even called her out, saying, and I quote, "The tears I'm seeing from the defendant are crocodile tears." Didn't matter how much she cried and choked on her words, she was still sentenced to life in prison. Moving on to number 8, we have Dylan Shoemaker. But before I go any further, you know the drill. Hit that like button, subscribe, and hit that bell notification button. Just do all that. It really helps us out. 17-year-old Dylan Shoemaker was arrested and convicted of murder and abuse of his girlfriend's child. He was asked to babysit the child, but when his girlfriend returned home, he had been killed. Apparently, the kid wouldn't stop crying, and so he turned to extreme measures. But in court, Dylan was the one that couldn't stop crying. He burst into tears while delivering his final statement. Now, apparently before he entered the courtroom, he told the guards that they should watch the performance that he was going to put on. So it could just be that him crying his eyes out was all just one big act to get out of his sentence. Didn't work though. Coming in at number 7, we have Jacob Morgan. In 2015, Jacob Morgan set fire to his house that led to the death of his younger brother. Now, Jacob argued that he didn't do it intentionally. The fire was an accident and he tried to save his brother, but before he knew it, the whole home was engulfed in flames. But Jacob loved playing with fire, and weeks prior he actually set his room on fire but was able to quickly put out the flames. In court, Jacob could not keep it together. While bawling his eyes out, Jacob can be seen praying. And then, when he gets his sentence, he freaks out even more.
I am going to find that there is probable cause to charge the individual with the down over for General Sessions Court for both charges.
Moving on to number 6, we have Antonio Barbeau. Antonio Barbeau was only 13 years old when him and his friend killed his great-grandmother. Apparently, the two wanted money for pizza and weed and thought to do so by killing the grandmother and stealing her money and jewelry. Let me repeat that again. They killed an elderly woman all for pizza and weed. That's ridiculous. Well, both were found guilty, obviously, and sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole in 36 years. During Antonio's hearing, he breaks down while reading his statement. His lawyer then had to finish it for him.
I took away someone's mother, their grandma, sister, friend, when I had no right to do so.
We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Fernando Salgado. So in 2012, Fernando attacked one of his classmates with a weapon, and then he tried to insert another up the classmate's rectum. As a result, he was charged with assault with a deadly weapon and 1 count of attempted assault with a foreign object. After receiving his sentence, Fernando broke down. He can be heard begging to let go when he's seen fighting with the guards. He's resisting with all his might, trying not to be put in prison. In our 4th spot, we have Spencer Lewis. Spencer Lewis was involved in an armed robbery gone wrong. He attempted to rob 2 brothers of their weed, money, and video games, but Lewis ended up shooting and killing the 2 brothers. He said he got scared during the robbery and that's why he fired. On Spencer's hearing, he entered the court smirking, acting all cocky and confident, which later turned into tears.
The victim's family, I never went there with that intention of hurting them.
But after his little breakdown, he can be seen leaving the court, smirking once again to the camera. So was it all just an act? Maybe. Moving on to number 3, we have Keyshawn Mann. I think this teen has to be the youngest convict on the list. Keyshawn Mann was only 13 years old when he shot and killed his mother's boyfriend, Jermell Stokes. He claimed that the boyfriend was mistreating him. Back in 2012, Keyshawn grabbed his mother's handgun, snuck up behind Jermell, and shot him in the back of the head. But his defense argued that the shooting was accidental. After he received his sentence, the courtroom went crazy. Keyshawn's family members were yelling and screaming, saying that he's innocent. And then one man got tackled and then removed from the court. Coming in at number 2, we have the collapsing duo. In this video, you can see Erica Mae Butts and Shanita Latrice Cunningham both resisting being taken away after learning that they would spend the rest of their lives locked away. Now, Landon and I did react to this video in our courtroom freakout video, so go check that out. But now I did some research and found out what they were in for. So Erica and Shanita were convicted of killing a young girl back in 2009. Apparently they were looking after her, but instead were torturing her for 2 weeks straight. That just makes me sick to my stomach. Well, in this video you can see the two flop to the floor and refuse to get up after hearing their sentence. In fact, one of the girls had to be placed in a chair and rolled away. While this is all happening, one of the girls' mothers is just completely freaking out. It was just complete madness in that courtroom. And in our number 1 spot, we have Shondell Jackson. In 2009, 19-year-old Shondell Jackson was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and robbery of a university student, Nathan Potter. During the attempted robbery of Potter, Jackson and his partner fatally shot him to death. During most of his trial, Jackson kept his cool. He showed no remorse for his actions, and at one point he even turned and smiled at the victim's family. But after being sentenced to life in prison, his demeanor quickly changed. Apparently he became angry and started cursing at the judge. He stood up to leap at the judge, but officers were there to quickly take him down and then pepper spray him. And that's all for
starting off this very unfair list at number 10 with Santiago Ventura Moraz. In 1986, he was convicted of murdering a 19-year-old man after they had an argument. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but maintained his innocence despite being offered a plea deal. He made several appeals after his conviction, but they were all denied. However, due to a lack of an appropriate interpreter and other deficiencies in the trial, it actually led to his conviction being overturned, and it was determined that a different person was responsible for the murder. He spent about 5 years in prison as an innocent man, but he had plans to become a lawyer someday so that he can help people in a very similar situation. And like I said, we all know there's many people in this situation. Timothy Masters comes into this list at number 9. On February 11th, 1987, the body of Peggy Hetrick was found in a field, and she had been stabbed in the back and sexually mutilated. 15-year-old Timothy Masters lived in a trailer that was only 100 feet away from her body. The police questioned him and searched his room and found several thousand pages of violent journal entries and drawings in his closet and a collection of knives. Even though there's no physical evidence linked him to the crime, he was charged and convicted of the murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Well, 12 years later, his sentence was later removed when DNA evidence proved his innocence. Timothy Masters was given $5.9 million in order to settle the wrongful conviction lawsuit. The wrongfully convicted Marvin Anderson comes into this list at number 8. Marvin Anderson was only 18 years old when he was convicted of robbery, sodomy, abduction, and rape. An all-white jury convicted him on all the counts, and he was sentenced away to 210 years in prison. I mean, is this real life right now? However, in 1988, another man came forward and admitted that he was the one that actually committed the crime. He fully confessed under oath. He did this in an open court, but the judge who presided over the original trial refused to drop the charge on Marvin Anderson. Marvin spent a total of 15 years in prison, but it took another 4 years to become fully exonerated. And now at number 7, we have Dennis Brown. He was convicted of rape back in 1984 when he was only 17 years old, and this is after the victim picked him out of a lineup. You know when they stand there and you're like, oh, he's the man, number 3? Dennis Brown claimed that the police had threatened him at knife point, forcing him to confess to the charges. The jury found him guilty, and when he was charged with aggravated rape, burglary, and aggravated crimes against nature, which gave him him a sentence of life imprisonment. Dennis Brown contacted the Innocence Project and DNA tests concluded that he was not the rapist. So in 2004, after serving 19 years in prison for a crime he never committed, he was finally released. The Dixmoor 5 comes into this list at number 6. The Dixmoor 5 are 5 African American men who were falsely convicted of rape and murder of a 14-year-old Katharina Matthews. At the time of the arrest, the 5 men were between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. During the intense and long interviews, 3 of them gave false confessions because they were coerced and physically abused and threatened during the interrogation. Each of them received at least 80 years in prison, but in 2011, DNA tests concluded that the semen on the victim belonged to another man. All of the charges were dropped after they spent 20 years in prison, and they finally became free men in 2011. They reached a wrongful conviction settlement of $40 million, which is actually the largest settlement in Illinois' history. Moving on to Thomas Hainesworth, and he makes it onto this list at number 5. He was arrested at the age of 18 years old after a woman identified him as the attacker. He was convicted of 4 violent rapes and sentenced to a total of 84 years in prison. Thomas Hainesworth maintained his innocence throughout his time spent in prison, and based on new DNA evidence, the real perpetrator was believed to have been his neighbor and closely resembles him. After the DNA testing, he was exonerated and was released from prison in March of 2011 after spending 27 years in prison behind bars. So for this wrongful conviction, he was given a lump sum of $1 million. I bet you the guy was taxed on it and only took home like just over half. He had 2 types of pensions, and he was also given a tuition at a community college. Christopher Abernathy takes the number 4 spot. On October 5th, 1984, the body of a 15-year-old girl was found behind a shopping mall. She had been raped and stabbed to death. More than a year after the crime, police brought in 18-year-old Christopher Abernathy for questioning. After 40 hours of interrogation, he had signed a confession which stated that he attempted to rape her and accidentally stabbed her with a pocket knife. Christopher was a high school dropout and he had a learning disability as well. So the police used this and coerced him into making a false confession. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison because he was 17 years old at the time of the murder. The jury initially wanted him to get the death penalty. After the Innocence Project picked up his case, new DNA evidence exonerated him of all charges and he was released after spending 28 years behind bars as an innocent person. The West Memphis 3 ironically make it into number 3 spot. This was a murder case that shocked the world. 3 little boys were found tied up. They were tied up with their own shoelaces, sexually mutilated, beaten, and left for dead. The local authorities arrested 18-year-old Damian Eccles, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, and 17-year-old Jesse Miss Kelly because they were known around town for wearing black and listening to heavy metal. All 3 of these teenagers were convicted of the murders and were sentenced away to serve life in prison, except for Damian Eccles, who was sentenced to death. This is a highly controversial case because all of the evidence was circumstantial, so a lot of people believe that they are actually innocent. The Scottsboro Boys comes into this list at number 2. They are 9 African American teenagers who are accused of raping 2 white women on a train back in 1931. These were 9 unemployed young men who were illegally riding the train. They were held in Alabama on minor charges, and they convinced these 2 women into saying that these young boys had raped them. Within 2 weeks of this false accusation, the Scottsboro Boys were convicted and 8 of them were sentenced to death. And the youngest boy, who was 13 years old, was sentenced to life imprisonment. One of the women who have claimed to be a rape victim came forth and admitted that she was coerced and manipulated into accusing these boys of raping her when they never even touched her. And finally, in the number 1 spot, we have George Stinney. On March 1944, 2 young girls had been found brutally murdered and beaten over the head and dumped into a ditch. George Stinney was a 14-year-old African American who was convinced of the murder as a result of racially biased and discriminatory jury. He was convinced in less than 10 minutes by an all-white jury and he was sentenced to death. He was denied an appeal and he was executed by the electric chair. A group of lawyers and activists investigated this case, and in 2014 he was exonerated of all the charges nearly 70 years later.